All right, again, welcome to the Top Step Consulting webinar. Today, we're going to be covering subcontractor management in OpenAir. So what is subcontractor management? What we're going to be talking about today is managing external resources that have a budget impact to your project and a cost impact to your project and some level of financial liability. OpenAir has a lot of different features for handling these. There's a few ways to view this. Sounds like I'm. So there are three basic approaches available for subcontractor management. There are expense items, there are purchase items, and there's direct timesheet entry. You can use any one of these. You can actually use combinations of these. You'll see at the end of our presentation, we do not recommend using all three together. The complexity that raises is just too significant. So let's talk about the expense item approach first. So with the expense item approach, your expenses module is used, and you have an expense item that you call subcontractor expenses that you would define in your system. And a project administrator or coordinator receives the vendor invoice or a finance person, and they key in an expense report in the same amount against the project. And it says against themselves. What that means is that they use their username attached to that expense. Or they have the option of proxying in as, say, the project manager and using that name against that expense. What you don't have is the option of using the actual person who those expenses are attributed to, because in this approach, that person doesn't have an account in your system. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. And you can put a vendor field on the receipt so that you can track things against specific vendors. The billing rules will control whether or not this is something that you're eating the cost of, or if you're rebilling this to your customer with any kind of a discount or markup. The advantages to this is that you can capture these costs against the project. They're reflected as expenses on not only the financial analysis report, but really any report. You can pull them in as expenses, just like your own employees' expenses. It's really by far the simplest approach to track these costs. And it does not require a user license for the subcontractor. And that's what we were just talking about, that you wouldn't put this under that subcontractor's name because you would not have a license for that subcontractor. So you would not be paying for a license for that subcontractor. Now, an alternative to this approach is that you could, in fact, give the subcontractor an account and have them put in expenses, but there's not necessarily a great reason to do that. This approach also allows for vendor-based cost reporting if you use that vendor field that we talked about. The downsides of this approach, again, that name, the rebuild expense appears to be owned by project administrator or finance individual or project manager, whoever you selected as the expense report owner. You may not want that. There is no ability to do any forecasting with this approach, because you're not in a position to forecast expenses. And there's no cost accrual support for finance. The expense comes in when it comes in, it gets listed when it gets listed, and it's very static in its time frame. Now let's talk about a purchase item approach. This is approach number 2. So we've talked about expenses, and again, that's pretty far and away the simplest approach to take. But it's also probably the least useful in terms of your reporting. Purchase item approach, the first problem is that you have to have the purchases module in place. And I know that from our customer base, the ones that I've worked with, there's just not very many that have purchased the purchases module. So if you don't have that, this would be something you would need to talk to OpenAir about buying as part of your subscription. If you do have it or you decide to use it, you identify a product called subcontractor fees. You would make purchase requests to create request items, and then those approved request items become purchase items. It's a workflow process that you have here. So someone could go ahead and request essentially a PO, and that would go through an approval cycle until at the end a vendor PO is issued for those specific request items. Again, a project administrator or a coordinator or project owner, finance individual receives a vendor invoice and they enter the fulfillment of the vendor PO into OpenAir. So OpenAir, the purchases module, if you're not familiar with it, it does have the option of creating purchase orders and putting them through a fulfillment process so that you can see every step of the way. And just like expenses, the billing rules control whether or not this is rebillable or any discounts or markups. There's a bit of setup required. You need to define your vendors. You'll need to define your purchasers. Now, chances are those will already be users in your system, so you probably don't have to worry about that too much. Then there's 4 other items that need to be defined one way or another. Whether or not you're using them, they have to have something in there for shipping terms, the FOB location, the carrier, the accounts payable location. Now, you can just use the term general in there if you're not really using them, but you still have to set something up. So whereas there's some setup to do here, it's really not that strenuous, depending on how much of this information that you're going to use. Now, there is also the concept of a quick PO, and this might be a little more useful to some folks. Basically what this is, it's a PO that's entered directly by somebody with the right permissions. Typically it'll be finance or a project administrator. There's no workflow here. There's no approval processes. There's no purchase request. What it is you get an invoice and you put it in as a quote-unquote quick PO. And then you can cost capture that. It only supports the actuals on your project. It doesn't go through, because this doesn't go through the workflow, you don't see procurement process, you don't see approved funding, an approved PO, etc. It's just there wasn't a PO, now there is. In terms of setting these up, you want to set up the quantity as whatever granularity that you expect from the vendor invoice. So if you're expecting them to submit hours to you, you want to set up the quantity as hours. If they are only giving you fixed fees on, say, a monthly basis, you'd want to set up the quantity as the months. So you could say this is 3 months at $1,000 a month or whatever it happens to be. So the tip is use quantity to match the granularity level of the invoices you're expecting from the vendor. Pros of this approach: you still get the cost captured against the project, reflects as purchase items on the financial analysis report as well as other reports when it's fulfilled. Instead of expenses, as with the previous approach, it'll show up as purchase items. There's no cost until it's fulfilled unless you use a quick PO, which is fulfilled automatically. So it does allow cost accrual with the fulfillment tracking. Again, if you're using quick POs, there is no fulfillment tracking. It just happens to now exist. But with the purchase request, you do have the full workflow and the full approval process. This also does not require a license for the subcontractor and allows you to report on your cost by vendor. And it's pretty easy to change the layout to accommodate different purchase items or specific purchase items. Now, the downsides to this approach, the first one that should be mentioned and isn't, is that you have to have the purchase module. And again, as I mentioned, not that many of the clients that I'm aware of have the purchases module. So you do have to have that in place before you can use this approach. It still doesn't provide you any ability to forecast. So it does, and it requires you to have some kind of a business process and workflow built within the system for your purchase requests and vendor PO processes. Go through these. Control vendor PO permissions by purchaser definition. So this is basically a user role. You would create a user that could be a purchaser, and you'd be able to identify the permissions for those POs based on that role. If you're not using quick POs, then you have to have a fulfillment entry to show any kind of impact in terms of cost. So you have to go through the fulfillment process unless you're using these quick POs. And so timing may become an issue at that point. Sometimes you want to display the cost before it's actually completed through the fulfillment process. All right, now the last approach, and the other con I would say to that purchase is it's for people who haven't done procurement in the past, somewhere in their history, it's a little bit of a challenge for them to wrap their head around how that works. So it can be a little bit of a learning curve for people if they haven't been involved in some level of procurement processing in the past. Now the timesheet approach. This is pretty straightforward. In this case, you use the timesheet module, which everyone has. You set up a subcontractor as a user, and it's a full resource. They have task assignments. They have bookings if you use bookings. They can receive late timesheet alerts if you choose to have that for them. And they enter their own timesheets directly. Now this last part, that doesn't have to be the case. It's not uncommon for a subcontractor to submit their timesheets to a project owner and have the project owner enter that information for them in OpenAir. But they still have their own user account. It's just that that project owner would proxy as them instead of giving them access or expecting them to enter it themselves. The time entries feature actually allows a reconcile with vendor invoices. Now this is a very little known feature that exists in OpenAir that I don't know too many folks who have used this or who are aware of it, but it's a pretty nice feature. And that's this. If you're in the Timesheets module, you have this time entries link here at the top. And what that does is it shows you, as you would expect, every time entry that you have in the system. So this can be a massive list. It's of course expected that you're filtering it by probably a number of different filters, clients, projects, the date. So you can do a lot of filtering on this list. Once you have it filtered to the list that you're interested in, you can mark these various time entries as invoiced when you receive the invoice from the vendor. So we go into the Timesheets module and time entries. You locate your specific subcontractor if you're using the time entries method. You can find this here in the user. It says Consultant A, Test User A. And then for every time entry that's on your vendor invoice, you check the little box here next to the entry. Then you can click it's actually not the gear, this is misworded, it's this little play button up at the top of the column to display a menu. And this is the menu you get, this Actions menu over here on the right. And what you can do at this point is you can say, set the reconciled value of these to invoiced. And you mark those as invoiced, and then this reconciled column shows you what was invoiced to you. You actually also have the option of marking them as paid. So you can have a workflow process that says we get the vendor invoice, we mark these time entries as invoiced to us, and then once we pay them, we can go back in and mark them as paid. So you can track the status of those various subcontractor time entries if you're using, again, the timesheet method. And again, these reconciled entries can be included in cost accrual reports. So you can now see cost accrual in terms of when the time actually occurred, when it was invoiced to us, and when we paid it. A few things to think about if you're going to use this approach for user setup. You're going to want to have a role for subcontractors. That will limit them just to seeing timesheets. There's typically no need, no reason for them to see anything else in your system. But even if you do have other specific needs that you want your subcontractors to be able to see, setting up a separate role just for subcontractors is a good idea. It gives you the opportunity to limit the views of what they should see outside of what your employees will see. We recommend defining a custom field, or even better, a user entity tag that we would call user type, with values to differentiate between employees and subcontractors. If you're not familiar with user tags, what that is a date-constrained field that lets you say from date 1 to date 2, this person was a subcontractor, and then we hired them, and from date 2 to date 3, they were an employee. It doesn't require you to create separate accounts, one for when they were an employee and one for when they were a subcontractor. If you just use a custom field, like some drop-down or whatever, to show that they're an employee or a subcontractor, then if they move from one to the other, you'd have to disable the first account and create a new one with the second value. Otherwise, it would look like they were always a subcontractor or always an employee if you just change the value. You can define a custom field on a user to identify the vendor that they belong to. And you can use those entity tags, as we talked about, to track contractors converting to employees. Again, with the with the timesheet approach, you have this cost override ability, which lets you say, whoops, not too far. Lets you say for this project or even this task, this user's cost is X, whatever the value is. With employees, we typically put in a cost at the employee level. This employee costs us this much regardless of what they're doing. For subcontractors, we could easily have different costs for different projects for the same subcontractor. So this override allows you to change those costs for that subcontractor based on either the project they're working on or the task they're working on. And so you would basically just select the resource and you would enter their cost for that project or task. If you're interested in those features, those are switches that OpenAir would have to turn on for you to allow project cost override or task cost override. Now, if you turn them all on, then you have this flow. If there's an override at the task level, it'll use that. If not, it'll look for one at the project level. If it doesn't see that, it'll use the cost in the user profile. So the pros of this approach: you get the costs captured against the project, just like any of the other approaches, but you also get the ability to forecast cost. And that's the one thing that this approach has that none of the other approaches do. Because you can enter these subcontractors as actual users, then you can enter bookings for them, you can enter task assignments for them, and you can use those values to forecast their cost, their invoicing, their revenue, et cetera, just like you would any internal employee. So this is the only approach that really gives you that option. It does allow the cost accrual through the time entry detail reports. It allows you to do vendor-based cost reporting, as all of these methods do, as well as specific individual subcontractor reporting, which not all of these methods allow. And the subcontractor's name can appear on the invoices for the time that they worked if you would like that option with timesheet entry that's available. Downsides to this approach: well, the big one, they've got to have their own license. So every subcontractor that you pull in theory, has to have their own license. Use a lot of these folks, that's going to get expensive. However, if you use a vendor with rotating users or something along that line, you can set them up as vendor user 1, vendor user 2. So for example, you could have, if you work with computer associates, you could have computer associates as your named user, or you could have 3 computer associates users, 1, 2, and 3, and then whoever happens to work on your projects can log in as one of those and enter time. So you don't have to necessarily have a license for each subcontractor. Of course, if you take that approach, a couple of the benefits you no longer have. For example, having the subcontractor's name actually on the invoice is no longer an option, obviously. So you want to make sure that your investment in your licenses doesn't significantly increase the cost of your subcontractor use. If you're paying offshore resources X dollars an hour and it costs you that same X to get them a license, thereby doubling their cost, probably not a good approach. It requires the subcontractor to be included in the late timesheet emails, which isn't necessarily what you want. You can control that with the timesheet required checkbox, however. You can basically make these folks so they are not timesheet required, and then they can opt out of those late timesheet follow-up emails. Now, if you're going to combine these approaches, first thing it says at the top of the screen, be careful, watch out. You have, anytime you combine any two of these approaches, you're at risk for double counting costs and or revenue. So if you're going to combine, for example, the timesheet and purchase module, which is a fairly common request because people want the pros of the timesheet approach, but they also want the control over the PO process. This will work really well for your accounting folks, but you just have to be careful that you use user cost and hourly overrides at 0 an hour, because your cost is not going to come from the timesheet at this point. It's going to come from the purchase orders. You can use timesheets and expenses as a combination, and that works just the same way that it would work for your users if they're putting in expenses for like travel and things. But if they're using expenses to show what they are billing you, you're going to have the same problem of double counting. So you want to be careful that you don't enter expense reports for the same vendors that are entering time. You can have some doing one and some doing the other, but you never want to mix the two. And then the last approach of a combination approach, expenses and purchases together, same things you want to be careful of. Don't enter expense reports for the same vendor that has a PO. So some might use the expenses and some might use the POs, and you have to be very careful about delineating that. Using all three approaches together, it's just a bad idea. It's just a bad idea. You'll regret it if you do it. The vendor cost complexity, just using any two of these together is likely going to cause a little bit of trouble from everything you have to monitor. Using all three is going to be troubling. So that's it for our webinar. We actually finished a little early. If you're interested in having us help you implement anything like this, for those of you who are not real familiar with TopStep, we have been around a while now. We've served, this says over 200 clients. I'm pretty sure the number is a bit bigger than that at this time. I think this is an old number. We have deep expertise in professional services, business operations. Again, for those of you not aware, we also do a lot of work in the financial force world these days on top of OpenAir. And we have certified in Del Boomi as well, which is where that webinar in a couple weeks is coming from. And I could put in a plug for Del Boomi at this point, simply from the standpoint that that's a tool that we use heavily, and we know that you can get really good results with that in terms of OpenAir and a number of other applications that you can integrate with, particularly cloud-based applications, although not limited to that. If you need to get a hold of me for any reason, you have questions about this, you'd like a copy of the presentation, I remembered my email address this time. I think it's the first time I've done one of these that I actually remember to do that. So there it is, jshine@topstepconsulting.com, and I would be happy to answer any questions I can. With that said, I'm going to stop the recording and unmute the phone, and we can have any questions that you guys want to bring up. Except for the program has crashed, and so I can't actually do that. I'm concerned that this will actually end our call. Not sure what to do here. I'm going to go ahead and exit this and see if I can get right back in. Please bear with me for just a minute. Well, I don't know who is still able to be on the phone. I am not able to get this service to function again. So I apologize for that. I would just ask then that if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and email me. I will get back to you as quickly as I can. Again, the email address there is jschein, JSCHEIN, at topstepconsulting.com. Or you can contact our support team at support@topstepconsulting.com. We'll get you an answer as soon as we can. I apologize for the technical difficulty, but thank you for joining this webinar. And again, any questions, just let me know.